All right, now, even as the India-Canada diplomatic face-off continues, India at the UNHRC has hit out at Canada saying it should prevent misuse of freedom of expression for inciting violence and deny space to extremist groups. Now, India, of course, has utilized UPR, that's the Universal Public Review of Human Rights Records of Canada at the UNHRC in Geneva. This is a unique mechanism that calls for each UN member state to undergo a peer review of its human rights records every 4.5 years. So even as the relationship between India and Canada have hit a low, New Delhi has recently told Canada at the UNHRC that it should prevent misuse of freedom of speech from inciting violence and deny any space to extremist groups. It also called upon Ottawa to prevent attacks on religious and racial minority communities. K.S. Mohammad Hussain, the first secretary at New Delhi's permanent mission at the UN office in Geneva, presented the statement of India during the UPR of Canada at the UNHRC.
The delegation of Canada for the presentation of their national report. We note the enactment of National Housing Strategy Act, Accessible Canada Act, and the National Strategy to Combat Human Trafficking. In the spirit of constructive dialogue, India recommends the following to Canada. 1. Further strengthen the domestic framework to prevent misuse of freedom of expression for inciting violence and disallow activities of groups which are promoting extremism. 2. Effectively prevent attacks on places of worship of religious and racial minorities, strengthen legislative and other measures to address hate crimes and hate speech. 3. Put an end to structural discrimination against children belonging to indigenous groups and address disparities in access to services by all children. We wish the delegation of Canada all success.
All right, so as I was saying earlier, this was the review that takes place of Canada's human rights or any member nation's human rights at the UNHRC. So India took this opportunity essentially to point out to Ottawa that it needs to prevent attacks on religious and racial minority communities. India utilized the UPR of the Human Rights Record of Canada to ask Canada to further strengthen the domestic framework to prevent misuse of freedom of expression for inciting violence and disallow activities of groups which are promoting extremism. The UPR, of course, is a unique mechanism of the UNHRC that calls for each UN member state to undergo a peer review of its human rights records every 4.5 years.